We'll give it a second to get everybody on. Welcome. We'll give it just a couple minutes to get everybody on, but welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I know it's always hard to get away from the kids and the family to stop what you're doing. So we appreciate you. While we're doing this, I'm going to go ahead and get our Spanish translation set up.
Yes, but I was going to ask you if I'm on as a translator because I didn't see the world on my screen.
Yep, I'm going to do it right now.
Okay.
So there we go. Welcome, everybody. We're giving just a couple minutes to let people hop on. If you need Spanish interpretation, please click on the world, the globe, and we'll have Spanish translation available. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us. I see a few familiar names that are hopped on. Thank you so much for that. We are recording, so if you're not able to watch the entire presentation, or if you have a friend who missed it, we're going to be sending it out to everybody who's registered. My name is Beth Burt. I am the Executive Director of the Autism Society tonight, and I'm so happy tonight I have a dear friend, Dr. Kitty. I call her Dr. Kitty, most everyone does, but Dr. Kitty Randall and Dr. Supley with us tonight to be talking about an important issue of screen time, especially for our young ones. And this is made possible by a grant we received from the Department of Developmental Services, focusing on early intervention. We know that COVID has brought a lot of challenges, especially to our little ones. And this is a grant that we're outreaching into the community to help them learn a little bit more about development. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Kitty and Dr. Supley, and let you go. I know you have a lot of great information. We'll be taking questions at the end. So if you have them, you can throw them in the chat or hold them to the end of the presentation. And with that, I will let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you to the Autism Society for this invitation. We appreciate being here with you all this evening. I'm so happy that my colleague, Dr. Supley, is here. She coordinates our consultation liaison service for psychology in the Loma Linda University Children's Hospital. So thank you, Dr. Supley, for being here with me. So I want to just start off by saying this is a tough topic, not because I couldn't talk a lot about screens and children, but it's a tough topic for parents, I think. It's a difficult issue, and we're all dealing with the issue of technology in our life, the role it plays, the benefits of it, and also the negative or consequences of technology. And for some parents who might be joining us, you've come perhaps to get some strategies. You're dealing with children who already are struggling with some technology issues in terms of the amount of time or what's happening there. And maybe some of you are here for prevention, understanding, because we're talking about the little tinies, a little bit more from that. So we're hoping that the information we share might be helpful, and we want you to know we're not here to provide any judgment, but rather to talk about having grace and support for each other, to provide tools and strategies, because all of us on this topic need to look in our own mirrors, I think. So anyway, so we'll go ahead and start our presentation. And just as we all know, today more and more children are spending more and more time in front of various technological devices. And the estimates are really, prior to the pandemic, it was 8 hours and 45 minutes a day. And since the pandemic, we know that's almost doubled, and it's become a lot more significant at even younger ages. So just thinking about the fact that technology is introduced to children, even infants, in the first few months of life. So just a couple of things as we start off to think about what the impact might be is I was working with a 4-year-old and asked her to draw her family, what her family was to her, and to explain it to me. But what she drew was a zombie family. And it kind of really struck me that that's what she related to when I asked her to do that. And then I was working with a 14-month-old and realized the 14-month-old didn't know how to turn pages in a book, but only knew how to swipe. And then it really hit me that this little one had never really experienced books. And then I was working with a 9-month-old and realized, because I always love that interaction with babies, and you get this smile and smile back, and realized that the little one didn't want to focus on any of us, but only on the phone, and had already at that young age realized the rewards of looking at technology and the multi-sensory experience. So this evening, in our short time, we're going to try to cover really quickly different things. I'm going to do just a minute or so more on an introduction to our topic. Dr. Suplee is going to talk about the benefits of technology. I'll follow up with some of the risks or consequences. Dr. Suplee will share recommendations, and I will conclude at the end, and then we'll have Q&A. But just wanted to, in the introduction, say a couple of things, because we all know that the pandemic really has impacted our lives so much, and certainly screens have, and it has significantly for children and technology. So I just wanted to take a few studies or a few things that were in the press, etc., about screen time soaring during the pandemic, even the post-pandemic. What we're seeing is in the research, about a doubling of the time, so that things have doubled. But what I wanted to point out is that study there with the graph, and the light blue line is actually the 0 to 4-year-olds. And you can see it's the steepest line, especially on game consoles or portable devices, and on a tablet or a computer. I guess not as much significantly different on phones. Seems like we were already doing some of the phones, but during the pandemic, you can see how high it went for the little ones, what a steep curve it was in terms of getting them onto tablets, computers, or game devices. And we know that we have promoted a technology-based life even for our very young ones. And what was really hard, in early education, especially, is teachers realizing that they were trying to compete for the attention of a child who, for the last couple of years, was really fed on technology. And that's made it a difficult situation. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Suplee to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of technology, and I'll come back after she's done and we'll talk about some of the consequences.
Thank you, Dr. Kitty. So, of course, we all know that there are going to be consequences to screen time. That's why we're here today. But we want to talk a little bit first about the benefits. There are good things that come out of using technology and screen time. And I think while we saw a significant increase in use of technology over the pandemic, we saw some benefits, especially at the early stages of the pandemic during lockdown. It was really important for our relationships, and especially for children. It was the only way they had connection to distant family and friends. We were isolating from each other. We were in these lockdowns that we had no access to other people. And so on one hand, we have more access, increased screen time. On the other hand, we're having time with our family, we're having access to people that we wouldn't have had access to, which we know it's really important for socialization to have access to people. So screen time allows that, especially now in this post-pandemic world. We're no longer in lockdown, we're no longer in quarantine, so we're able to be with people. But what about grandma and grandpa who live across the country and you don't get to see them all the time? You still want to foster those relationships with children, or with their grandchildren, or siblings who live older siblings who live far, or friends who've moved. We want to be able to create those relationships still, and technology offers that to us. We can do video chats, we can do online gaming, and be able to connect with friends who have moved during this time, or, you know, like I said, the grandparents who live across the country and you're just not able to see them as often. It also provides you quick access to message with your children. We now have a lot easier ability to get in contact with children, and vice versa, for children to get in contact with their parents than we did even when I was a kid. I didn't have a cell phone when I was a kid, so I had no way of getting a hold of my parents in an easy way. I had to go to the school office, or wait until I was home and had my grandparents' phone. We have the ability to get a message to them quickly, and that goes for children to be able to get message to you. And that sometimes can be really important, not only just for day-to-day scheduling and what's going to happen next. It can also be really important if there is a crisis and they need to get a hold of you quickly. So technology allows us the opportunity to do that. Next slide, please. Educational. We talked a little bit about how the pandemic forced us to be quarantined and isolated. That also included academics, and children were going to school on screens. And while we're going to talk about, the negatives to that, we have to recognize that it allowed us to have academics for at like a year. At times, we were able to transition to online classes and virtual learning, and being able to have access to that when otherwise they wouldn't have had access to school for, in some instances, was a full year that they were not going back to school. Beyond the pandemic, the internet allows us access to a world that we might not have had access to otherwise. A lot of children learn a lot about the world through the internet and technology, and they have access to news articles about anything you can think of. We'll talk about why that might not be always the best in some circumstances, but it does offer them access to the things that would be really challenging nowadays to have access to. And they can also use that technology to help with their learning and help with academic requirements. Beyond the pandemic, we're still seeing a lot of use of technology in schools because it just makes it easier. In some cases, access makes it easier for some patient or some children. Being able to help for tutoring, that's so important, and having access to tutors, which maybe they didn't have before. Online educational resources or educational games, they now have access to that. I do want to caution, though, that it's not all it's not a perfect system. Well, having access is great. There's research that's really mixed in terms of how we learn, how our brains learn and absorb that information. And there's some current research that's coming out that our brains may prefer paper over screens in terms of learning and memory, but the research is mixed. And I think we're going to continue to learn more, especially now with the reliance on technology and the increased use of screens. I think we're going to continue to know, we're going to learn more, but right now we're seeing we're not really sure. I think it depends on what you're looking for and what benefit you're looking for your child. It helps children who have disabilities have access to do things they may not have been able to do before. And, I think about things like assistive devices, children who do not have, or who maybe have language impairments and need the use of assistive devices to communicate with their family, communicate with their caregivers, communicate at school. And that technology, that screen time use, allows them the ability to communicate when they may have not have been able to do that before. Medical advances. This is very important for children. We are learning a lot more. Science is improving every single day, but for children who have a medical condition, I'm thinking of children with diabetes who now have access to sensors, monitors, pumps, all through the smartphone. That we know improves adherence to those routines. It makes it easier to comply with taking medication, comply with what your treatment plan, what your doctors have asked. And it also makes it a lot better for you as parents, for you to monitor how your children are doing, for you to have access to their medical care. And have access to their medical teams. Technology screen time allows us quicker access to that. And there's some research that shows having quicker access or access to your healthcare record improves satisfaction with your healthcare overall. And I would imagine that's for adults. And I would imagine that's very similar to parents for their children. We want to know what's going on, especially so for example, if they're at school, you have access to this through screen time, and it's important to be able to have access to that in terms of their health. But it's all about balance. Just as with everything, it's all about balance. And while we see some really important benefits, we saw those benefits during the pandemic, we're seeing them post-pandemic, and every day our world is changing. There are, of course, going to be consequences with the increased use of screen time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Kitty to talk a little bit more about what those consequences are.
Thank you, Dr. Suplee. Yes, so those consequences are related to when screens come in too early or too much, or they're misused, and in a variety of screens, which can negatively impact all areas of a child's neuro and social development. So I'm going to talk just a little bit to those before we go into recommendations. The first thing, of course, is information. So what is the information that young children are getting from the screens? And they're very susceptible to believing that everything that pops up on the screen is real. So we want to really be monitoring what's going on there, and that the information, be careful, because the information from technology can set the values and beliefs of your child if you're not there to specifically address those and to provide your own family values and beliefs for the child. One of the big areas, of course, is physical health, and there's a variety of things we're looking at, vision and a variety of other things. But one of the ones that's been studied the most is really looking at childhood obesity. And the more time on screen, the more we're seeing that increase in that. And there's many different reasons, but probably two that are really important to remember is that when you're on screens, you're more sedentary. So what you want to do is to make sure that you're looking at the fact that outdoor play is missing when we're on screens. And the other thing is that I think some people aren't aware of this, that when you are eating in front of screens, your metabolism, the way your body digests, is lower than when you're sleeping. So if you're eating while you're watching something, you're actually, all of that's with the slow metabolism going into that issue of obesity. So that's why it's recommended not to eat in front of screens. So physical health is one. The other thing with physical health that's a big issue is that related to sleep disturbances. And it can be related to content that a child's watching that continues to be bothering them or floating through their heads while they're trying to sleep, and especially if it was scary. But probably the biggest thing is the disruption to the actual sleep waves. So it disrupts sleep brainwave patterns when you're in front of screens, the blue screens, as we call them. Those screens stimulate the brain in such a way that it really does impact that. So we want to make sure to not have screens for at least 90 minutes before bed. The other thing that Dr. Suplee was talking about was that sometimes we can see it as useful for gaining information for learning, but actually the more time you spend on it, the lower your frustration tolerance, you have less trial error learning. And so it can actually decrease problem solving. It can make you more impulsive, less trial and error learning. And so the more time spent on technology can impact pre-academics. So one of the studies talked about just 9 minutes of fast-paced television cartoons can have an immediate negative effect on a 4-year-old's problem solving, attention, planning, and ability to inhibit. So just watching what it is in terms of content and amount of time. With the issue looking at it from a developmental, and we're going to spend a little bit of time specifically on infants and toddlers, but as we look at it, when I was saying it affects all areas of development is just to remember, because we're talking about littles, those first few years of life, there is a ton of growth happening, and the brain is organizing itself literally in connections made based on what it takes in. And so overexposure to technology is associated then with problems with executive functioning. So the ability to organize and plan your thoughts, to pay attention. It's also related to some delays, especially in expressive language and some sensory concerns. And we see more difficulty regulating, so more tantrums for a variety of reasons, but also on how the brain is developing. More specifically, as it relates to infants and toddlers, one is the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Canadian Society of Pediatrics has said no screen time from birth to it was 24 months, and I think Canada still is. In the United States, it's looking at about 18 months, but certainly no screens then because of the developmental impact, not just on relational interaction, but also on the fact that the screens then affect vision, all areas, tons of areas of development for little ones. So what we see is between birth and 2 years, an infant's brain triples in size. And the early development of the brain is really determined by what they're experiencing in their environment. So the less experience they have in the environment, the less connections that are made in a broader sense. And also we understand that all development occurs in the context of relationship. And there's many things we could talk about there in terms of the kind of neurotransmitters and the things that are released in the body in context of relationship that don't happen when you're in front of a screen. So what happens then is that viewing a screen and what's happening in front of the infant or toddler can become habituating. So it doesn't offer the stimulation that a parent thinks their child is attaining, but rather it becomes more rote. And what happens then is that these patterns that are playing throughout an infant's infancy become the repetitive experiences that they learn. And we know that repetition is how an infant learns. So if what they're seeing is just screen and it's based on this repetitive stuff, then what we see is that the repetition of watching something on a screen becomes a habit. So it becomes, that's where I'm going to focus my time. That's where I'm going to have my learning. And it inhibits other important developmental experiences like playing outdoors, engaging in the arts, socializing with peers, playing sports, those kinds of things. So you actually are training your brain into habits of behaviors as well. And so when we think of it, all areas of development in the early years grow in the context of relationship. And so when we're on screen, we minimize those relationships. Dr. Suplee did talk about the fact that we can get some relationship from the screen by seeing grandparents and those kinds of things. And those kinds of things can be really helpful if there is no way to do that in person. But we also want to balance that, because we know that the more screen time the child has, the less time they're actually interacting with in-person engagement and less creative play. So face-to-face, not two-dimensional representation is really important, especially early on, for both well-being and development, physical development, social, emotional, and neurodevelopment. Just a couple of areas to highlight is that of language, because I hear so often where parents will say, but they're learning language on the screen. They learn those words on the screen. And actually they do learn some of those, but because a lot of things are fed to them, the area that we see the most delay in is in expressive language. So it's more the social, relational, and pragmatic part of language, and the communicating from from the baby to you, or the toddler, or the young child. The other thing that I thought was interesting that I wanted to share is that while expressive language delay is one of the things we see most frequently, there was a study that showed that overall language delays are more prevalent if the family is watching during meal times. And so what this talks about is the fact that, okay, your child may learn some vocabulary on the screen, but applying it in life and using it in conversation requires having conversation. And the place where we tend to get that is during family meals. So if family meals are occupied by technology, you're losing out on a significant number of opportunities for social interaction. And so that's why that can be. I want to just share this video with all of you. I need to give you just a little bit of backdrop. It's a video that I developed with an occupational therapist, and we were talking about babies, and we were talking about babies that are born with prenatal substance exposure. But this information is relevant to all babies, and actually through the age group that we're talking about. So I thought it might be helpful to share it with you because it really talks to the sensory processing concerns, which is one of the most prominent issues that we see for particularly the age group we're talking about tonight, the littles. Let me share that with you.
We all know that there are wonderful benefits to technology, but nowadays we are using technology with infants in a way that it's starting to show real concerns. We have devices like strollers, baby bouncer seats, and even little potties as the children get older, with devices that will attach an iPad or a phone to that infant carrier or stroller. What does this mean from the perspective of an occupational therapist to babies in general, but in particular to babies who are suffering from neonatal abstinence syndrome? The first concern we have is the amount of stimulation. The American Pediatric Association does not recommend screen time for children under the age of 2 because the visual input they receive is too fast-paced for their brain, and it is very dysregulating for these infants, especially for NAS infants. There are babies who are very good at manipulating technology and using iPads and phones. They may even be able to go in and out of different apps. But the concern is that they are not developing fine motor skills. If they are not manipulating objects, which means toys, blocks, rattles, or books, if they are not utilizing those tools, then they are not developing those critical fine motor skills. So we highly discourage the use of iPads, cell phones, and we know that caregivers often will hand over the cell phone to a child to distract them because they are busy. But that is something that we do not recommend. It's just not a healthy way for a baby to learn. Recent studies indicate that the more screen time an infant or a young child has, the more sensory integration problems or sensory processing issues they have. And the reason for this is that as they interact with technology, they are not interacting with their environment. They are only interacting with a screen. If they are not manipulating or exploring or on the floor, or having that tummy time with a parent, playing with toys, reaching for toys, then their development is actually being hampered. Not only their motor skills, but their sensory development, because the only stimulus they are getting is visual and sometimes auditory, but not always. They're not getting the tactile stimulus, they're not getting the movement, they're not getting a lot of the input that is necessary. From an occupational therapist's point of view, sensory processing is foundational for all other types of learning. If we visualize learning as in a pyramid, sensory input is the foundation for all types of higher learning. A well-integrated sensory system is absolutely necessary in order to have higher learning. Any further development in higher learning will be built upon that foundation. If there are missing pieces to one's sensory system, that system will not work effectively. In the long term, children whose sensory system has been deprived will have problems concentrating, paying attention, sitting still, focusing. So the moral of this story is that there is no replacement for the human contact. Children need to be stimulated in all sensory areas in order to develop properly and effectively. And having that human contact with their parents, with a caregiver rather than with technology, is absolutely essential.
So what we see from other studies that look at sensory issues is that sensory motor and cognitive issues pop up more and more in later childhood partly because of the inadequate opportunities to move, play, and engage at an early age. And so as a result, we see more problems with how they feel their body in space that can later look like aggression or clumsiness, or their need for constant movement that can later look more like attention issues. And children who don't learn through physical play are more likely to be clumsy, have difficulty paying attention, have trouble with their emotions, poor problem solving, and difficulties in social interaction. So really important is that movement. The other thing is, of course, relationships. We grow and we learn in context of relationships. And so when we don't have them, we have difficulty with communication, sharing. And then what happens as we spend more time we're more distracted by screens. The little ones have less desire to be with their parents or their family. And what we see then is an increase in behavioral problem with a lot of dysregulation and upset when screens are removed. Even little ones can have issues related to depression and anxiety and impulsivity. And children who become accustomed to immediate gratification, we also see then less attention skills and more impulsivity over time. Of course, even our little ones are exposed to a vast number of violent themes, even in casual technology use. And we know all of us have probably been bombarded with things we didn't want to see because it pops up on our screen, depending on where we're at or if we're on the internet. And violent themes often really, obviously for young children are a poor modeling of conflict resolution, so can really impact the littles as well. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is we're seeing very young children in the age group that we're talking about tonight, from 0 to 5-year-olds, that are becoming, where addiction is becoming more and more of an issue. I was speaking to a mother the other day who the young child, who was, I think, about 3, was so addicted to screens that would scream anytime anyone took the screen away. So this is becoming more of a serious issue. And there are places, I think predominantly on the East Coast, that are actually setting up residential centers for children to come for addiction. I think Dr. Suplee is going to talk to you about a book that might be useful for parents whose children are already having this issue. But the big thing is that we want to make sure too that parents understand that safety is a consequence, that we really need to monitor what the children are looking at, because there are dangers that can come into the home that penetrate through our screens rather than just through our otherwise through the community. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Suplee right now to talk about recommendations.
Thank you. So there are things that you can do as a family and as parents with your children. You've decided we're gonna take the screens away. We're gonna do the recommended amount of time on screen use each day. That's going to be challenging at first, but there are things that you can do to set yourself up for success and also to create more of a positive experience within your family as well. If your children have lots of access to technology, you also have lots of access to technology. And just as Dr. Kitty was talking about, the relationships have probably or have been impacted because of that. And so we encourage no technology during meal times, but have family dinners together. It's so important for relationship development to have family dinners together where you're talking, communicating with each other about your day. We know it's so important for language development, as we just talked about. It's very important for mental health as well. And it sets your family up to have an open relationship and be able to talk about your day, your struggles, we're talking about little ones right now, but if you set these patterns up when they're little, as they grow into preteen and teenage years, you've already established that connection within your family, and this routine that we have these dinners together and we put the screens down and we have time together, have family trips, family day outings where there's no screens or very limited technology use, and just have fun together. So much, especially now, there is so much on our plate as parents and adults, and there is so much day to day that we forget that it's also fun to be a parent and have time together and enjoy being around each other. So many times I talk to families about this because, as adults, we wear many hats, and things are not getting easier in our world. There's a lot more demands on us. And it just starts to feel like I'm just kind of day in and day out doing my routine, that I've forgotten that I really do enjoy being around my children. I really enjoy when we have this family time together. And sometimes we have to be intentional about setting that time aside because, like I said, things are busy and that's not just going to happen. So when you plan these trips or day trips or even half a day or a trip to the park, plan quality time with your children and as a family, and you'll also find that your relationship with them will grow, their relationship will with you, and just your family unit will feel stronger. Exercise is so important. I know Dr. Kitty talked about the physical health impacts of screen time use. Children should be getting at least an hour of exercise a day. I know that is really hard. If they're going to school, they're getting some recess time. As they get a little bit older in school, they may get some physical education time. But our younger ones are spending a lot more time at home. Or even if they go to daycare or preschool, they may not be getting that dedicated time that their body needs for development, for health. We also, as adults, would very much benefit from more activity, exercise ourselves. We are not immune to that. And so it can be a really good activity as a family to do things together that are physical exercise. And it doesn't have to be formal. You don't have to enroll them in sports. If you want to, that's great. That's absolutely an appropriate way to get physical exercise each day. Can be structured playtime, or it can just be going to the park, playing outside on a playground. It can be going swimming in, we're lucky to live in Southern California where we have access to pools most of the year. And so being able to go out and swim or go for walks as a family, all those things are really important. Getting away from screen time, but very much building part of your routine as a family to have exercise. Moving their body is going to be so, so important. We know for their physical health, but also for our mental health. The more that we move our body, the more we're able to regulate those emotions that come up throughout the day. The American College of Sports Medicine recommends no more than 2 hours. And we already talked a little bit about how it should be even less than that for children under the age of 5. But no more than 2 hours per day on technology related activity. And that's because they really want children to move. They want children to move their body, engage in play activities that are not screen time related, move around, move, and for adults to do that with them as well. And the idea behind this is that the time that you're spending with or the time that your children are spending away from screens should be with someone. But they're also recommending that this time children are using on screens should be with someone as well, rather than in isolation. And I believe I have a slide on that talks a little bit about why that's so important. But a parent who spends time with their children using screens knows what their child is doing. You're spending that time together, which is important from a relational activity, but they're not able to find something okay, perfect. They're not able to find something inappropriate on the internet by accident. And the key to a lot of the issues that we're seeing with technology use, even in very young ages, I think about YouTube. So many young children just use YouTube to watch. There's tons of cool videos on YouTube, lots of fun things that are so engaging, but they just sit there and scroll and find something that's interesting to them. But you can keep scrolling and keep scrolling and keep scrolling. And I've heard that at some point, those parental controls fall off for YouTube, and they can eventually go down holes that are not appropriate for children, or find videos that kind of sneak through those parental controls. And that just puts your child at risk. And so supervision and awareness of what your children are doing on the internet will solve a lot of the problems. If you know what they're doing, if you know what they're viewing or accessing on the internet, you're going to be able to step in and address it. For example, if you find out that they are viewing violent content, you're going to be able to step in and stop them from doing that, or have an understanding. Oh, that's probably why I've noticed some behavior changes. That's probably why they're acting out, because they accidentally got access to something that I wouldn't want them to do. And so having supervision prevents that from even happening. Screen time limitations, we already talked about that a little bit. No screens before the age of 2, and 1 hour of screen time per day between the ages of 3 and 5. And this really should be more high quality content, educational content, with you supervising them, supervising the use of screen time. Decide what those rules are for your family. Set rules on what like technology they can use. Do you want them using computer, using the internet, or having access to all that is on there on the internet? Set the rules for your family and be consistent. That's going to be the most important thing. The consistency is going to be key, especially if they could, you're hearing this for the first time and you're like, okay, I'm going to set a new rule in the family. No more internet, no more screen time. it's going to be tough. And so the more that you're consistent across your family, the more your child's going to understand why these rules are in place. Set parental controls. I know I talked a little bit about how YouTube, eventually you won't have those parental controls in some instances, but those parental controls do exist for a reason, and they are a really important tool if you feel like it's necessary for your family. Make it, there's ways to set up so that they have to have passwords for the Wi-Fi, and they can't use it outside of the house, or you have to put in a certain password. Only adults use the password for the internet. You're giving them permission to use that internet device or screen time, but they don't know the password, so they can't have access to it outside of the times that you decide. Again, decide for your family within those recommendations. But the more that you start to put those limitations on screen times, the more your child's going to understand, like, okay, this is the new routine, this is what we're doing, and start to comply with that. A great way to increase supervision and access to safe access to technology is having a safe space in your home. For example, the computer is only in the living room where mom, dad, caregiver has access to it. You're watching what they do, you're monitoring it. And this is just to prevent improper browsing. Again, even with the littles, it happens. There are some really scary things that happen on the internet. They may not have any understanding of it. They may have typed in something that could have been completely innocuous and innocent, and the internet does what the internet does, and they get access to something that's inappropriate. And so for you to have access or supervise that, have it in a common area in the house, for example, a living area, or in the kitchen, dining room table, only when if you want them only to use your smartphone, only when you're sitting next to them doing that. And then we also want you to be available and connected to them. So we want you to be there while they're using these screens. They happen to get into something, then you can address it, but you also can do things together, and that just builds your relationship time as well. If you've decided no internet whatsoever, we're only going to do, for example, a video game, but it's like the dancing video games where you get to move your body. That's all we're doing as a family, but you're there monitoring what they're doing and you're connecting at the same time. So here are some recommendations. Dr. Kitty talked a little bit about Dr. Dunkley's book about, it's called Reset Your Child's Brain. And this book is really helpful for parents to help you when you decide, all right, we're taking the screens away and we're going to do a complete reset of our household. This will teach you strategies to help end those meltdowns, because there will be meltdowns. There will be times that they're going to be upset because it's a change in their routine. Children are always upset when there's changes in their routine. They like screens, so why are we taking it away? They don't understand that. So there will be meltdowns, and that book can help give you strategies to manage those, help improve academics, which we know is impacted by the use of screen, and social skills as well. We're just coming out of, we're in this post-pandemic world where our socialization was very much impacted, especially for our littles. That time that we usually learn those really, really important social skills was impacted by quarantine and isolation, and we didn't get access to other children in the way that we did before the pandemic. And so now screens are certainly part of that. And so this book will help give you some tools as parents. And I also included some books that are for children, picture books that you can read with your children to explain them why it's important to put the screens down. But they're picture books, so it's much more in child-friendly language. Screen Time is Not Forever. That series is great. There's a bunch of different types of behaviors that they look at. Worries Are Not Forever, Hands Are Not for Hitting are some other titles that go along with that series, but Screen Time is Not Forever, and it talks about why it's important to put our screens down and what we can do instead, which is really key for kids because they're not going to initiate new tasks. It's just really hard for children to initiate new tasks. But if you teach them what to do instead of screens, they're going to be able to do that. Or if you give them alternatives and say, okay, we're not doing screens today, we're going to do an art project together, or we're going to play with Legos together, or we're going to read this book together. It's going to be a lot easier for them to do that behavior than to just turn the screen off and hope for the best. Unplugged Ninjas for a little bit older, probably like 4 to 7 years old, but the Ninja series is great in that exact same way. It talks about why we do the things that we're doing and how to address it. And that series also has other ninjas like Sad Ninja or Angry Ninja, Positive Ninja, Calm Ninja. So I recommend these books for children. I've had a lot of success with children really enjoying those books.
Thank you, Dr. Suplee, for sharing that. And I just wanted to say I've had some families work with Dr. Dunkley's 4-week plan and really help to turn the family and the addiction issues around. I did want to share that Dr. Dunkley also wrote an article that specifically looks at autism and screen time, and it's called Special Brains, Special Risks. And she talks a little bit more to the issues we were talking about with sleep, and children with autism, many of them have sleep problems, so this would impact it even more. Arousal regulation issues, so some of that sensory regulation stuff that we see as a concern for children with autism, and we see it screens impacting that more. The social and communication deficits. So she's really talking about that many of the things that we see as problems with screens are already risk factors for many children with autism. And so it's important then to realize how impactful screens might be and the importance of really regulating it. And so in conclusion, as we sum up, I think one of the things that we want to talk about is really, I loved Dr. Suplee's recommendations, because it's really on what to do, not what not to do, but what can you do? So we do know that kids, probably the littles, are spending more time than what's recommended. So what are some of the things that we can do to promote activities that aren't screens? Engage them in a more social world, art, sport world. And my philosophy is time in. What children need from is more time in. And so they need each one of us. And just as a reminder, of course, we want to remember each one of us, parents don't escape the digital age unscathed. And technology is at every one of our fingertips, so we can become the distracted parent, and we get that. So parents are just as prone as children to spending too much time in front of screens, and it will affect the attention that you can give your child. So we all need to really examine how technology functions as in our family, not just for our children. So concluding, children need their parents to be present, providing boundaries, routine, and nurturance, which are the keys to resiliency in order to get the best from technology. So in parenting, tots, even not just the little ones, but tots to teens, what our children need is time in with us, not time out with technology, or what I call techno-isolationism. And remember, if we're struggling and we've got kids who are really struggling with technology, or we ourselves are, remember, it's never too early and it's never too late. So please love them, keep them safe, and prepare them for the future. At this point, we're happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you both. That was very eye-opening. So I appreciate lots of great information, and I appreciate that you delivered it with, like you said, Dr. Kitty, grace and kindness, and knowing that it's something that we all, I think, struggle with as adults as well. We had a question about the presentation. If you will be willing to share the presentation, we can send it out when we send out the video of the recording, if that's okay with you.
Actually, I think I have a document that summarizes it all, and maybe I'll do that rather than the slides, if that's okay.
Yep, I think that's okay. We have a thank you. This was such a great presentation. Thank you all. So that's great. Does anybody have any other questions for Dr. Kitty or Dr. Supley? I know it was a lot of information and it's a lot to digest, but thank you, because I have to say personally, I have not heard that information before. I don't know, we have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you both.